Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Barron, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Barron.
Welcome back to Early Returns. This is a podcast about law and politics. I'm your host, Jan Barron. Our producer is Jody Mayer. It's been 6 years now since Democrats first made their accusations against Donald Trump and his campaign, claiming that they were colluding with Russia. Perhaps not since the Watergate break-in has a political attack turned into so many legal battles. There have been congressional investigations, an independent counsel, even an impeachment trial or two. There also were side battles resulting in criminal convictions, unrelated counts such as tax evasion and fraud by former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. Even today, there is an ongoing investigation about the investigations and how all of this got started. A second special counsel has charged a Clinton lawyer with lying to the FBI when claiming that a Russian bank was communicating with the Trump campaign. That trial is concluding as we record this episode. My guest today is someone who has spent time as one of President Trump's lawyers and has witnessed how these investigations were unfolding. Ty Cobb was in the White House responding to Independent Counsel Robert Mueller's requests for documents and information. Ty has a long and distinguished career as a criminal defense attorney and is recognized as one of the best in his field. Ty, welcome to Early Returns, and thank you for being willing to talk about these important recent and current events.
Well, I'm honored to be on with you, Jan, and congratulations on Early Returns.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, before we get into some of the juicy meat here, what it's like to represent a president of the United States and deal with all of these legal issues, tell our listeners a little bit about where you grew up and what was your path to being a lawyer.
I grew up in a little town in western Kansas called Great Bend on the Arkansas River, and I was the oldest of 8 kids. My dad was a Navy aviator in World War II and ran a couple of radio stations in Kansas, and it was an idyllic childhood. I love that area.
And how did you wind up eventually getting to law school and being a lawyer?
So my father moved to D.C. while I was in college with a family, and they lived out on Lake Barcroft in Virginia, and he ran the National Association of Broadcasters. He was originally chairman of the board, and then he became the senior vice president for government relations and radio and TV relations. So he was there, and I was visiting at one point, and he was pressuring me, as he had routinely for a few years, go to law school. He got ill, and it was clearly very important to him, and he passed away, and so I did it.
Well, sounds like his foresight was a good assessment of your potential and your skills, right?
Well, exactly.
And I'm sure your dad is proud of you up in heaven.
I hope so.
Well, when you started off your career, I think it was as a prosecutor. Is that right?
Well, I clerked for a federal judge in Maryland, and then I was briefly at another firm in D.C. But shortly after my clerkship, I returned to Baltimore to be a prosecutor.
So what was your first big case as a prosecutor?
So, it's hard to think back that far into the last century, but the first case, I think, of consequence, I'd tried a bunch of bank robberies and a bunch of small fraud cases and stuff. But the first case of consequence was I tried a fascinating case involving the importation of pure cocaine by the vice consul of Thailand, who was importing it in diplomatic pouches and selling it to the mob, among other customers. And we got the first surveillance order ever with regard to a diplomatic pouch. And sure enough, he took it home and we scooped it up, and he cooperated, oddly enough. And that led to several cases, including some organized crime figures. So I think that was probably the first time I made it to page 34 of the Baltimore Sun.
Well, certainly not the last time. And the diplomat claim diplomatic immunity of any sort, he wasn't charged.
So he tried, but under the applicable treaty, and the case law, the privilege didn't apply. And Thailand refused to sustain him. So that was helpful.
Well, good. But he was not charged, I gather.
Oh, no, he was charged, but he ultimately pled guilty. So that was helpful. And he cooperated partially with the rest of our investigation.
Well, intersecting with foreign nationals was something that you've done periodically as an attorney. You also had a little bit of introduction to campaign finance rules in the aftermath of the 1996 election, when there were a lot of instances of foreign money coming in to political parties in an age when political parties could take corporate money, union money, and unlimited money, and some of that turned out to be from foreign sources. There was even a fundraising event at a Buddhist temple, unbeknownst, I gather, to Vice President Gore. What was your role in that squabble?
So with regard to the Buddhist fundraising event in Los Angeles, I represented John Wong, who was at the time a sort of a joint official at the DNC and at the Commerce Department. And he had helped to arrange the meeting, and he'd been there, and there were allegations that he was up to something nefarious. Ultimately, he was never charged with any of that. He did enter a probation agreement with the government in connection with a local Los Angeles election that had been years earlier. But we also had Senate hearings, spent a lot of time with Senator Glenn, Senator Thompson. They were the riding point for their respective parties at the time, and trying to work out, whether he would testify and the extent to which he would cooperate. But ultimately, he did testify.
Well, before you got to the White House, which would have been in 2017, had you represented as a client any politician at that point?
Yeah, I'd represented several. I had represented one of your former colleagues from Bush 1, who had been a cabinet secretary, and that never became public, and he never suffered from that. And I had represented, in the Clinton years, it was high water.
Right.
You had Whitewater, the Rose Law Firm billing records, the Vince Foster suicide.
But your clients would have been individuals that were somehow connected to the investigation. Any senators or congressmen or presidents before you got to the White House as your client?
Yes, I'd represented 3 cabinet secretaries. I'd represented President Kennedy's sister, Jean Kennedy Smith. I'd represented a couple of congressmen in the long ago House Post Office scandal. So yes, I'd had a lot of experience, and I worked on the Hill before I went to law school, which was a big help in terms of being able to navigate those waters.
Well, how did you wind up getting to the White House, and what exactly was your position and role?
Okay. So I was a special assistant to the president, which is the highest staff level position. And I was special counsel to the president. My assigned portfolio was the Russian investigation that morphed into more areas over time. I got there in an odd way. I had been vetted for a high-level position at the Justice Department early on in the administration, and I had a couple of supporters from that period who were urging me. And then John Dowd, formerly of Aiken Gump, longtime prosecutor and Justice Department official, was hired by the president, and he also supported the president hiring me. And ultimately, I was contacted to discuss this. I have a little funny story on that, which was the White House called, "Can you hold for the president?" And I said, "No." And his assistant said, "No, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, I could hold for the president. We could have a conversation, but I'm in Russia." So I was on a National Geographic tour. I was in Russia, and I said, "Let me call tomorrow from Norway." So ultimately we met. I didn't take the job immediately, and we negotiated some significant conditions, one of which was that I would be deeply grateful, and it was necessary to my service that he not criticize the special counsel anymore.
That's Mr. Mueller. That's Robert Mueller.
Mr. Mueller and we'd met 30 years earlier, and I had a lot of respect for Bob, and we were friends. And it wasn't going to be helpful to keep firing at him. We needed to set a cooperative tone and at least a professional tone. And the president accommodated me for the better part of 10 months.
Any other conditions you can share with us?
I had a few other conditions, none of which I can share with.
All right. So you were a senior White House advisor. Technically, who was your client? Was it the president?
So it's interesting. People always say, why do people pursue this distinction between you representing the presidency as opposed to the president? And it's a fair question, but legally it's highly consequential. Had I represented the president personally, as Dowd did along with Jay Sekulow, I would have had a strong attorney-client privilege. But because I was a government official, my oath and duties were to the people and to the Constitution. And the case law on that is pretty settled. In Ray Lindsay in 1998, DC Circuit opinion, where Bruce Lindsay, who had been President Clinton's personal lawyer in Arkansas before he was elected, and then deputy White House counsel and special assistant to the president, had various roles that caused him to assert privileges before the grand jury. And that case went to the DC Circuit. It went to the Supreme Court. They declined to hear it until they got a ruling from the DC Circuit. And the DC Circuit parsed all those privileges and drew what were pretty clear lines in terms of the conversations you're allowed to be in with the president that don't put him at risk.
So the privileges, just for some of our listeners, particularly those who are not attorneys, the privileges basically are two. There may be more, but the two fundamental ones are if you're acting as the attorney to a client, you have an attorney-client privilege, which means whatever your client tells you or whatever information you obtain is not discoverable. It can't be subject to questioning by prosecutors. And the other privilege would be the executive privilege that a president would under certain circumstances. So being on the White House staff, as opposed to being the personal attorney for the president, means that basically the attorney-client privilege doesn't apply, right? Because that's not your client.
So under Lindsay, it applies in a limited context if the president is soliciting your legal advice on a matter related to the functioning of the government. That's sort of a hard line to toe, given all the complications of being the president and, how one answer leads to other questions. So the Lindsay court acknowledged that privilege existed, but basically subjugated it to the executive privilege analysis, and that it was distinct from the personal attorney privilege, which was much stronger. Judge Tatel wrote a concurrence. Well, he dissented in part to argue that point, that he believed that the government attorney privilege should be broader. And frankly, I think if it was revisited today, his reasoning probably would prevail. But it hasn't been relitigated, so those are the rules.
So even as government attorney, the executive privilege would be highly applicable in terms.
That's the predominant analysis.
Okay. And so that's really what protected the confidentiality that might exist between you and, in this case, President Trump. And how often did you confer with the president while you were doing this work?
I had an office right at the bottom of the stairs to the Oval, and I found my experience pretty aerobic. I was running up and down the stairs pretty regularly. I often had lunch with the president, and this matter took up a lot of time, which, given some of the recent revelations, I think may change the course of how it's judged historically.
So just to set the scene here, you're the senior White House lawyer on this particular matter, but you're not Trump's personal attorney.
That's exactly right.
He did have personal attorneys, and that would have been John Dowd and Jay Sekulow at that time. And then on top of that, of course, there was the White House counsel, the usual White House counsel. That would have been Don McGahn. But as I recall, he was recused from dealing with Mueller and the investigation. Is that correct? He stepped aside, or was there some other reason that he couldn't do the job that you were hired to do?
Ordinarily, he would have done the job that I was required to do, but getting back to the N. Ray Lindsay analysis, certain of the events that preceded me moved him into a witness category, and he determined that he and initially his entire office would not participate. Ultimately, halfway through my tenure there, I did get a couple of young lawyers from his office who were great assets to me, along with your colleague, Darby Grant, who was on my team.
We're proud to have her as part of our team now. So Don McGahn, the White House counsel, kind of couldn't really be helpful the way you were because he was potentially a witness. And in fact, he had been asked to be a witness numerous times by Congress, by Mueller, and so forth. So you're dealing with the president on a daily basis in the White House, climbing those stairs up to the Oval Office. How often are you dealing with Mueller? And I assume his team would be dealing with you on a more regular basis. But what was the interaction like between them and your group?
It was extensive. It was highly professional. I don't recall any situation where anybody raised their voice or started pointing fingers or shouting or anything that was uncivil. The people I dealt primarily with were leaders of the investigation, and principally Jim Quarles and occasionally Bob himself. And quite frankly, we had a similar goal, which was let's try to figure out how to get them the information they needed to finish what they were doing. I mean, my interests were speed and exoneration because I didn't think it was good for the country that it be protracted. And at the outset, we, after some back and forth in terms of demands and timing and stuff, which we didn't agree on initially, but I made a couple of signs of good faith, gave them certain things that they'd been previously denied, and we built a sense of trust. And we concluded that pursuant to a Office of Legal Counsel opinion issued by former Attorney General Mukasey in 2008, that they could avoid subpoenas and we could thus together avoid hostile litigation within the executive branch against the president, the White House, against the Justice Department by cooperating in a way that preserved the executive privilege. So the understanding of our cooperation throughout was that it did no harm to the executive privilege. And the opinion by Attorney General Mukasey, it's not a partisan opinion. In fact, it was relied on heavily by President Obama during the Fast and Furious investigation.
Mm-hmm. What you just described, many people may not realize, is a common dynamic when there is an investigation that touches the White House. The White House lawyers want to preserve executive privilege. At the same time, they want to have the investigation be done with. And the investigators, of course, want certain information. But usually nobody wants to have a prolonged legal dispute over who gets to get what information from the White House. And the White House doesn't want to risk losing leverage with the executive privilege. That's something they want to preserve. Everyone has an interest for different reasons to avoid litigating this in court because it may come out to someone's disadvantage, not only in that case, but going forward for future presidents or future investigations.
No, that's exactly right. And the last thing I wanted to do was spend 2 years in court litigating this while, the fact of the absence of any justification for the Russian collusion claims was up in the air. I think it was a tough time for the country. I think we're seeing today still international and national consequences of those false claims.
You also probably didn't want to spend 2 years working at the White House, right?
Well, so for me, I have to say that those are pretty heady issues. It's easy to lose yourself in them intellectually. And it gets to the point where, you sort of go into work every day knowing that there'll be a new confounding issue. And in a way that's stimulating, but it was a difficult environment.
Avoiding legal fights that are prolonged and in court was probably in both Mueller's interests and the White House's interests.
It was. And they were very professional. I've never said anything else.
Yeah. And so your tenure there at the White House was for a year, approximately 2017, 2018. I gather that whatever it is that Mueller needed up to that point had been provided to the investigators? Or was there still ongoing back and forth for interviews and documents or whatever?
So there might have been a couple of strangling issues. I mean, there may have been some issues that were still up in the air, but they weren't consequential issues. And by the time I left, I was done. I had provided all the documents voluntarily with the president's approval, of course. And we had urged the White House personnel and administration personnel who were asked to be interviewed, go be interviewed. And they had all been fully vetted at that time, including Don McGahn.
How many staff were interviewed by Mueller's office?
I would be approximating it, but I would say in the neighborhood of 30 to 35. And that's not just White House staff, but other significant administration personnel.
And were the personnel mostly people who had worked in the campaign as well as in the administration?
Certainly early on, it was a lot of campaign people, but as things went on, it morphed beyond that.
And of course, the examples of interconnection between the Trump campaign and Russian representatives that were made public at the time seemed to be somewhat minor. There was a campaign meeting at the Trump headquarters in New York with some Russian nationals. There was a meeting abroad by a couple of very minor Trump campaign representatives. They weren't even really campaign staff, but they might have been fundraisers.
So I think the two most talked about, but irrelevant personnel in that regard were Papadopoulos and Carter Page. And, much has been made of what happened with Papadopoulos. He had a colleague, they were having a discussion. He mentioned that people were trying to reach out and give him intelligence on Hillary, but he wasn't acting in a campaign situation. Carter Page, his FISA warrant is really a shameful event in the annals of American politics, because not only did the FBI know that he was an active CIA source, but he had done work for the FBI, none of which made it into the FISA warrant. And also omitted of great consequence was the fact that, that FISA warrant followed the department's, as this has come out in the Sussman trial, was previously public, but not focused on. But the FBI, Peter Strzok in particular, and James Comey were alerted on, I think, July 30th of 2016 that the Clinton campaign had indicated that they were going to attack Trump vigorously through a false flag operation, claiming connections between him and Russia. And rather than look at that, they opened up an investigation into the Trump campaign, which I know is sort of at the heart of what John Durham's looking at. And I believe Mike Horowitz is taking another look at that too.
He's the Inspector General of the
Yes.
Department of Justice. So there are a lot of characters here. There are a lot of investigations of the investigators.
Yeah, well, and Mike is as liberal as they come, but he is an honest guy and a straight shooter and, a hell of a public servant. So I think ideally between the two of them, they'll get to the bottom of it.
Well, when you were trying to cooperate with the Mueller investigation, was it known to you at that time that, for example, there had been misrepresentations in the application for a warrant from the FISA court, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act special court that issues warrants? And there's been an FBI agent who has pled guilty since then of falsifying some information in that application. Was that information known to you, for example? How about the allegations, which have been proven unfounded, that there was communications between a private Moscow bank called Alpha Bank and Trump? These are things that were going on even unbeknownst to the public in some respect. But were you knowledgeable about that? Or was this information subject to security, confidentiality, or whatever?
So the reality is we were not as knowledgeable as we would have hoped to be. We only had strands, but we did know that the Clinton campaign and the DNC had funded Perkins Coie's payments to GPS Fusion and the connection to the Steele dossier. And that we did know that we knew of the Alpha Bank allegations, but we didn't find out from our own Justice Department. We found out from the New York Times. And we were pretty quickly able, with the documents at our control, to search those and came quickly to the conclusion that that was unfounded and was going to remain unfounded. There was just nothing that could put that together. So we had pieces of it and we learned some things. I mean, the president learned some things here and there from the CIA and the FBI that raised a lot of questions, but we didn't have answers for them at the time.
All of that investigating by the Mueller's team led to the Mueller report, which was publicly issued about a year after you had left the White House, having done your work. And when the report came out, what was your reaction to it? First of all, with respect to what they said about the allegations of collusion or collaboration with Russia.
So I thought it was about 4 times longer than it needed to be, particularly on that point, because there was just nothing. I mean, yes, Russia had a couple of bots. Unfortunately, in our time, since the Cold War, that's not unusual. You know, they were up to some mischief. They ran some ads, but their investment in the mischief making was pretty paltry. And they weren't the only international actor on that. And, you know, it's one of those situations where if you spend 300 pages on it, sounds like it's a big deal, but there's no comparative thing as to like China or Iran, who probably were more effective actors in that world.
So the bottom line with respect to the collusion investigations, the investigation started with smoke and it ended with just a big splash of water. There was never any fire. Is that right?
It's like Neil Young once said at a concert, he said, "I'm sorry that song sort of started out slow and then fizzled out altogether."
And what about the discussions in the Mueller report regarding obstruction? They spent a lot of time talking about theories of obstructing the investigation. And I mentioned Watergate in my introduction, which occurred 50 years ago, next month, by the way. And that was a real break-in. So there was a crime to initiate that. But the real legal problems that stemmed from the Watergate break-in had all to do basically with obstruction and lying.
Yeah, all of that. Right, exactly.
All of that. And of course, that is really the kryptonite in any sort of investigation like this. And as a defense attorney, you're trying to warn your folks, look, whatever the bad thing is that caused this investigation, don't obstruct justice, don't commit perjury or lie to FBI agents and things of that sort. And I was just going to say that the Mueller folks just couldn't refrain from talking about obstruction because they were hoping to get some of that too, right?
Well, and their obstruction theory, it's never been the basis for any prosecution. So, you know, there were 2 lawyers on the staff that aggressively pushed that. I'm not sure the intensity with which Bob himself was approving of the legal theory, but the way it was written, as you say, it's like a bunch of conspiracy theories where there's no connecting thread. And I thought that was unfortunate. I think something that people don't appreciate is that the president had the authority to direct that the report not be issued. He had an executive privilege, and one of his obligations under Article 2 is to manage the criminal justice system and protect the integrity of it. So he had 2 veins where, you know, he could have ordered most or all of the report not to be released, but he didn't. I'm glad he released it. I think that was transparent, and I think it's out there, and I don't think that report will stand the test of time, particularly now that the world knows that the day before the case was initiated, you know, the Justice Department was aware that Hillary was scheming to go after Trump and try to tie him to Russia in a false flag operation. I think had that information surfaced, and I think that's an important point, because we know Strzok knew, we know Comey knew, but I don't believe anybody on the Mueller staff knew. Because as a lawyer, you would immediately focus on that and consider the appropriate course of the investigation.
Well, in addition to what Comey knew, there has since been reporting of documents released by the CIA at the end of the Trump administration that seemed to reflect that CIA Director Brennan sent a note or had briefed President Obama that the Clinton campaign and Hillary Clinton personally was going to make a attack through press of this Alpha Bank allegation. And that came out just this past week that Hillary had authorized the press to do so in testimony in the trial of Michael Sussman.
Pardon me on that point, which is that's almost exactly right, except that predated the Alpha Bank thing. She later authorized the Alpha Bank allegations to be brought forward. But in July of 2016, the allegations were not specific, just sort of general Trump collusion. I think the significance of that is what I was referring to is had Strzok told Mueller, for whom he worked, about that, and Strzok was the lead investigator for Mueller before he was discharged or sent back to his office and his phone was taken away. Had he told Mueller or the lawyers on the staff about that, which he knew, I think that would have shut down that investigation. It certainly would have taken a different course.
Interesting. Well, when the report was released, Attorney General Barr made a statement. And actually, his statement, Barr's statement, was a summary of the report, which had not yet become public. And the Attorney General was criticized for the summary that he made. And some people thought that kind of glossed over some of the more critical aspects of the Mueller report. What was your reaction to Barr's public reporting of the Mueller report?
So I have two thoughts on that. I think you can argue about his word choice and how he described things. But what people don't understand, I think, out in the world, he had a statutory obligation to issue that under the Special Counsel statute, that upon receipt of the Special Counsel's finding, the Attorney General shall notify Congress and, if necessary, the public as to the findings in a summary fashion. So he was fulfilling a statutory obligation when he undertook to issue that letter. And then secondly, if you compare the Mueller report to Moby Dick, his letter was basically man chases whale, man dies. That's a simple book report. So,
or didn't find the whale at all, I guess.
Exactly, a white whale.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Bill Barr did towards the end of his tenure there and in the aftermath of the Mueller report and all the criticism was that he ensured that there would be an investigation about the investigations, right, and created this independent counsel or special counsel, they call it now, John Durham, who's been looking into this for the last couple of years. And that's how we have seen a little bit more information about how the FBI investigation started and some of the strange twists and turns in the episode about the FISA warrant and so forth. And of course, the one charge that has been filed, a criminal charge and is in trial right now, is against the Clinton lawyer who is accused of one count of lying to the FBI when he met with the general counsel of the FBI. But the lie isn't about the substance of the allegations that he made. There was this collusion between Alpha Bank and the Trump campaign. The alleged lie is that he went in and supposedly, and this is contested, but supposedly said, I'm not representing anybody here. I'm doing this because I'm a good citizen and I fear for my country. And the accusation against him is that he made that statement when, in fact, he was allegedly representing the Clinton campaign in the Democratic National Committee, which, in fact, his law firm was extensively representing at the time. It was the same law firm that had started the Fusion GPS report and the so-called Steele dossier that resulted from it. So what do you make of that case? I mean, it seems pretty limited and very, very attenuated to me. I mean, and is that all that's there in the Durham investigation?
I don't think so. I think the issue we discussed earlier about the CIA briefing not only the president, but Susan Rice, National Security Advisor, and others at the White House, and then alerting Comey and Strzok as the intel that they had about her scheme, I think that remains under investigation. So the statute of limitations on Sussman's alleged crime was about to run. They had to bring that case at the time they brought it. And I don't know what happened today. I don't know whether he testified or didn't testify. But in terms of the dispute over the client issue, it appears to be a dispute between Sussman and himself, because he testified under oath in Congress that he was there on behalf of a client. And as we found out yesterday or the day before, he billed the Clinton campaign for that on that day.
Well, Just before we started recording this episode, there was a press report that Mr. Sussman will not testify at his own trial. And that means that the next day or two, we're likely to see that case go to the jury. And by the time everyone else hears this episode, they probably will know what has happened. But no matter what happens, your theory is that there's still ongoing investigations going on with Durham.
I believe that. And I've had at least one consequential witness in that investigation over time. I know Durham, and I have a lot of respect for him. And at some point, whatever he does, he's going to be falsely accused of partisanship, like goes with territory there. And he's far from a partisan. I mean, he made his bones prosecuting a Republican governor in Connecticut. And he's always been somebody he's a lifer. He's well respected by the courts, the judges he's appeared in front of. And I was very impressed in my interactions with him. So, I think he's slogging through it in the same way that I had to slog through it. And hopefully he'll get to the finish line, whatever it is. I mean, wherever it takes him. They may not have another prosecutable case, but I suspect they do. And I'll certainly read his report with interest if this administration allows it to be published.
Now, your work for President Trump and at the White House in the summer of 2018, so that's now almost 4 years ago.
Thank goodness.
That gives you some perspective on the experience, I'm sure. What interaction, if any, have you had with President Trump since leaving?
Virtually none. I'm not a hanger-oner. I'm not somebody who was ever part of the personal circle. Our interaction was intense, but, it was professional. And I never voted for him, and that frustrated him. So I'm not among the favored few, and I don't regret that. I wasn't there to impress anybody or make friends. I was there to do a job. Well,
there are a lot of stories written by Michael Wolff about Trump and the Trump administration. They're terrific books. They're entertaining. As my wife would say, at least half of it is true. But it's always entertaining. And the impression I have, because I've never dealt with Mr. Trump, the impression I have from just following this incredible storyline is that being a favorite lawyer is not necessarily a positive. And there are lots of lawyers who tried to help the president before he was president, while he's running for office, and while he's president, that find themselves with tattered reputations, and in some extreme cases, find themselves behind bars for unrelated reasons, perhaps. But it's not necessarily an attractive proposition. And I do recall one or more of the impeachments that the president went through, that he actually had difficulty finding lawyers to agree to represent him during the impeachment.
And I think that's interesting, but it's so true. You would hope the president could receive quality representation just because of the office. He certainly needs better guidance. Certainly the guidance that he got with regard to the post-election activities once he lost, and January 6th was horrible advice. And I think the big lie, as it's called, and the January 6th events are two tragic examples of American political events. But I think it's difficult when your client wants to hear what he wants to hear and you're not telling him. But as you know, in the job we've labored at over our careers, if you don't give them to him straight, you're not doing them any service.
I agree with that completely. And I think the post-election interaction that we have read about between lawyers and Mr. Trump is a combination, the worst combination, which is bad legal advice combined with the client from hell. That doesn't lead to a very positive result. I want to thank you for sharing so many frank opinions and insights. As I usually do with a guest, I always encourage some book recommendations. I know you're a very avid reader of books and always have an interesting reading list. Any that you'd like to share with our listeners?
So Lonesome Dove is my favorite book of all time by Larry McMurtry. And I've got a little bit of a cowboy spirit given my Western Kansas days. But I stopped reading fiction several years ago. It's not like a hard and fast rule, but I try to read mostly natural history and science related, but I occasionally venture in. And the principal reason is I know so little about them. I thought it might be worthwhile to spend time learning more about the world. But I have recently read 2 books. Evan Thomas is a friend of mine. I read his book on Sandra Day O'Connor called First. And that's an excellent biography. And then I read The Price of Peace, which is about John Maynard Keyes. It's a fascinating read. It's by Zach Carter. And I can recommend both of those based on my recent experience.
Well, thank you. I know Evan Thomas as well, and I've read some of his book. I wasn't aware of this one. And so
I first started reading Evan Thomas in the Harvard Crimson when we were in college together. So.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, he and his wife Ossie still reside in Washington. So I'll make sure that he knows that you have cited his books.
That's good.
Well, Ty Cobb, thank you so much for being with us on Early Returns. I appreciate your time and your insight. And I also want to acknowledge a thank you to Jody Mayer, our producer, who put all of this together. And we look forward to our next episode and hope that we can sustain this type of intriguing conversation with our next guest.
Well, it's been an honor, and best wishes with the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Barron. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.